Hey everyone, I wanted to just talk about the three typical firmwares that you'll see in 3D printers a little bit more. As we discussed back in a few videos, there's three main types of firmware: Marlin, Clipper, and Reprap firmware. So Marlin, just to quickly go over it, it's the most common one, especially for out-of-box printers. I mean, Ender uses all Marlin. Tronxy printers do use the flavor of Marlin, I'm sure. ANET printers, Lulzbot probably use them. A lot of different companies use Marlin. Marlin definitely is fully functional. It does lack some Wi-Fi support. It's definitely very annoying to compile it on a computer. You do have to use Platform IO, which is basically a coding IDE, and you do have to go into a whole bunch of different config files to configure your board and pins, and the two config files are quite large and do have a lot of text, and it's not very human readable. I have compiled Marlin firmware for a custom printer, the Viking, and it was a custom Core XY, and it takes a little bit of time to compile a printer. I know a lot of people who've had problems with that, and also getting touch screens and getting LCD screens to work can be very troubling with Marlin. But like I say, it comes on most out-of-the-box printers, and it is a very common firmware. A lot of Facebook groups and things like that generally will have like different flavors of Marlin that you can install without having to compile, especially Creality being a very popular printer. So the next firmware type obviously is Clipper, which we went through on our build video of our Delta printer. That's my firmware of choice. I just prefer its simplicity. It's very well documented. The text file is just one config. You don't need to compile it over and over to make changes. It's a quick edit of a file and click save, and you can start using it. The downside is you do need a Raspberry Pi. It is getting a little bit difficult to find Raspberry Pis, especially Zeros. I know the Zeros discontinued, I think, because the Zero 2 is out now. So hopefully those will start showing up a little bit so you can buy those a bit easier. But yeah, Clipper definitely has a very nice community, really good web interfaces like Fluid and Mainsail, and Octoprint are fully supported with that. So that's just my firmware of choice. However, recently I did purchase a Ender 3 off of Facebook Marketplace for pretty inexpensive, and it came with a Duet board, which uses the Reprap firmware. So Duet is kind of the premium company that make Reprap boards. So here we have the Duet 2 Wi-Fi, which is what came with my Ender 3. The nice thing about this is it comes with onboard Wi-Fi, as the name says, and the Wi-Fi on these boards is actually quite nice. It's very fast to connect. Basically, you can just flip the switch on the printer and it's joined your Wi-Fi within 5 seconds. It doesn't have a Linux overhead. It doesn't have to boot to Linux and go through all this stuff just to connect to Wi-Fi. It just uses a simple ESP32 for Wi-Fi, so it's very handy for that. And it does have 5 stepper drivers here, and they are quite robust. These are TMC 2660s, so I believe they can handle actually quite a bit of amps, 2.8 amps, which is quite high. So the hardware in this is actually very robust. Really nice screw terminals. It's got fuses on most anything here. It does kind of have a little bit unique motor wiring. It does come with connectors in the box, so you can repin your motors. There are some tricks. You can directly plug Creality steppers in here, which is what I did basically. There's some guides online to do that. So these are relatively expensive, but they do make clones of this board. So you can go on to AliExpress, of course, and you can find a clone of the Duet. Personal preference if you want to buy original or buy a clone, totally up to you. I don't actually know what came with my Ender 3. I want to say it's probably a clone. but it worked out quite well. And these are quite inexpensive, around $70. The Duet also does support a couple different sizes of touchscreens. So that's quite nice too. They have a pretty decent interface if you want a touchscreen there. That's very easy to use. So that's one option there, a clone Duet. And there's also a couple other companies that make their own versions of Reprap boards. So here we have a Mellowfly, which is a nice little compact board that has TMC 2209 drivers, and it has onboard Wi-Fi as well. And that's $62, so quite inexpensive. Looks like they do have support for screens as well. I don't know if that's a touchscreen or not, but they do have support there for screens. And then they do have a pretty nice web interface. It's a little bit cluttered for my personal tastes. I do prefer Mainsail or Fluid with Clipper, but there are definitely some nice features in the interface. Setting up Reprap firmware, in my opinion, is probably in between Marlin and Clipper. It's not as difficult as Marlin, but it's definitely not as easy as Clipper in my opinion. So I have an example config file here. So this is the config folder that's basically on a Reprap board. And you can see here in the sys folder, there's a fair amount of files in here. And it's set up a little bit odd in my opinion. You'll see this homeall.g. If we open this up with a Notepad++, oddly you'll find the position of your homing and all that kind of stuff in this folder, or in this file I should say, whereas the rest of the printer configuration, or a large part of it, is in this normal config G. I don't understand why this isn't all in just one file. I'm not a huge fan of that. But this file is quite readable by humans. It's relatively straightforward here. You can look up a lot of these functions. They do have relatively decent documentation for some things. And they do have some nice commenting and things like that. So you can see your stepper motors here, what the current you have set up for your stepper motors, speeds, accelerations, that type of thing. There's a little bit of vague networking information here. One thing I don't like about Reprap firmware is you have to set up the Wi-Fi using a terminal program such as YAT or something else along those same lines. And it can be a little bit perplexing trying to join Wi-Fi and, forget your old Wi-Fi and connect to a new Wi-Fi. So setting up of the Wi-Fi is a little bit annoying. Then you have your other typical information down here, your heaters, and your thermistors, fans. There's 3 temperature controlled fan ports on the Duet right here, and then there's 2 always on fan ports. So it's actually got a lot of fan ports on the actual Duet hardware. I believe the Mellow board here has 2 temperature controlled fan ports as well. So that's nice. So yeah, I mean, this looks very similar to Clipper, and it kind of has a lot of the same ideas. However, it's definitely not quite as user-friendly as Clipper. They do actually have a web configurator. So if you go to Reprap Firmware 3 configurator here, they actually do have an online tool to build your firmware, which is actually a really nice idea. It'd be awesome if Clipper actually comes out with something like this where you could go through kind of a wizard and it would set up your printer for you. So they have a couple small templates here that are already custom made. So like they have a Ender 3 Pro here, they have an ANET A8, that type of thing. They also have custom, of course. You can also upload your existing config and make changes as well. So we can just run through a config here really quickly. Pretty straightforward what board you're using. They do have a couple different versions of boards on the Duet's page here. So if we go back to Duet, this is, like I say, this is the Duet Wi-Fi But if we just go to Duet's website, they do have a couple different models, I believe. So they have Duet3, which I think is a bit more expensive. They do have expansion boards as well. They have an expansion board also for the Wi-Fi too as well. They have a dedicated Ethernet one, a couple different boards. So you can see the Duet3 here is even more money. Again, this is genuine hardware. This one I believe even has higher current drivers. This is 5160s, so really high current. Probably not like super needed for 3D printers. So you can choose your board there, the latest firmware. You can name your printer, and you can choose what motion system you're using: Cartesian, Core XY, Core XZ, Delta. I have looked into their Delta firmware. I don't like how you configure or calibrate the Delta. It seems a little bit complicated to actually configure a Delta printer. Clipper definitely is much simpler to configure a Delta, but that's kind of just what I noticed. Your kind of min and maxes of your axes. Homing preferences, pretty standard. You can just leave those default for the most part. And then here's where you can kind of set up your input and output mappings. So you can actually configure your fan pins. So like I say, the Duet 2 has 3 temperature controlled fan pins, and then it also has 2 just normal fan pins that are always on type thing. You can set up your Z probe here. It's a little bit confusing on the terminology and that type of thing. So you kind of got to research a little bit on how setting up the Z probe and what pins you're using, because there's so many different options on the Duets. What heaters you have, you know, your bed and nozzle, very straightforward. What the output is, and also what sensor port you're using for the thermistors. Your motor settings, again, this is kind of standard to most anything. You got to put your steps per millimeter in here. You need to put in your max accelerations, your motor current, that type of thing, which is handy that you can control motor current in here very easily. Your extruder, steps per millimeter, that kind of thing. End stop configuration, quite handy here. You can actually reverse, choose what kind of end stops you have. Again, gets a little bit more confusing here because Z, there are options for like Z probe also in Z. And then you have trigger heights and all these different probe types and things like that. So props to them for giving you all these options, but they don't really explain a lot on how to set these up, and you got to dig a little bit into their configuration. And it's not as simple as Clipper, where you can just go to one web page and find out very quickly what kind of you need to use. Their documentation is spread all over a little bit, I find, and can be a little bit hard to dig through, but it does still work. I did set up a probe on my Ender 3, and I'll probably make a little video after this, just kind of showcasing the printer. So here you set up your heaters. This is your thermistors. I don't know why default it goes to bang bang for your actual your calibration for your thermistors. I don't know why you wouldn't default to PID. It's definitely much better to use PID. So you can set your temp limits in here. This took me a ton of time to figure out. What had happened by default, these were actually reversed to what my slicer was trying to do. So my slicer was trying to actually heat up heater 0 as the nozzle, and it was trying to heat up the nozzle as the bed. And it took me quite a long time to figure that out, and I had to make a whole bunch of changes. So that to me seemed a little bit odd. I never had that problem with Clipper before, so it was just kind of something to note. So do note that. I had to go back into like the IO mapping and kind of mess with these, swapping these two over and all sorts of things to try and get it to work, but I eventually did get it. And then in fans, whatever fans you actually set up for your input and output section, you can then set them up as if you want them thermostatically controlled or if you just want them to be on all the time, and what heaters do you want them to monitor. So you could actually set up a fan to monitor your nozzle and only turn on at 45 degrees so that you can leave your printer on all the time and the fans won't be spinning unless you're heating up your actual nozzle or the nozzle is above 45 degrees. So that's kind of handy. It is, again, it's a little bit convoluted here because they don't really tell you a whole lot when you come to your nozzle. So your tool, which is your nozzle, you can see here I only have one fan option, a fan 0. If I go to my fans though, I have 3 choices. And fan 0 is set to not be thermostatically controlled. And that's why it shows up here. If you see, if I turn all these off to be not thermostatically controlled, I can now choose what fan I'm going to be using to be my nozzle fan. So it's a little bit confusing because, I mean, I want my nozzle fan to be thermostatically controlled. I want it to turn on at 45 degrees. However, I think what they don't tell you, if I remember correctly, these will be thermostatically controlled by default. You just have to choose the no option, and basically the firmware handles it, versus setting these up as thermostatically controlled for like other devices. So you could set these up with other sensors to turn on. However, if you want to actually do your hot end, you turn it off and then it will actually set that up for your nozzle, which I find a little bit confusing. It took me a little while to figure that out, but I'm sure if you used Reprap Firmware very often, it'd be a breeze to set these up afterwards. Compensation is your bed mesh, very similar to Clipper. And then network. It's quite handy actually to be able to set up your network through this config file. However, it's a little bit odd in the fact that you actually still have to terminal to the board and set up Wi-Fi first and get to the actual web interface before you can upload this to set your Wi-Fi. I didn't have too much problem. They do have a really good guide on how setting up the Wi-Fi through the YAT terminal. But yeah, if you don't have a config file, it won't actually save your Wi-Fi state. It'll always be kind of set to off if you don't upload a config. So you essentially have to terminal to your Duet2, set the Wi-Fi up, go to the actual website, and then upload your config file with your SSID and password. And essentially what it'll do is it'll save those, and it will save the Wi-Fi state, so that when you turn the printer off and turn it back on again, it automatically turns the Wi-Fi on and connects to your router. So again, a little bit odd, but it does function very well, and it is nice to actually be able to do this. Another annoyance here though is changing your Wi-Fi. There's no real easy way to change your Wi-Fi after it's been set up. I had to do this on my Ender 3 because I'm getting ready to sell it because I'm done with the project. And you have to basically research a macro to wipe the Wi-Fi out and then go back into the YAT terminal, configure the Wi-Fi, and then go from there. So you can't just upload your existing config file, put in your Wi-Fi here, and then re-upload it to your printer. Also something to note too, like in my custom configuration here, I have some custom things set, like in my home all-G, for instance. So my probing on my Ender, I actually set my probe point to be the middle of the bed. So, which is 110, 110. This actually isn't configured through here as far as I could tell on any of the settings here. So it's not really great to actually re-upload your config file, make changes, and then download it again, because it'll wipe out some of the configs you've done in the config file. So yeah, Reprap Firmware is definitely kind of confusing on how they do this. This configurator is really an awesome idea. However, it's not like fully 100% there in my opinion. It should be able to edit every single file in the folder here that are necessary. And I wish it was, a little bit better as far as detail was concerned on kind of how to set things up, and they have a little bit more documentation right here versus you having to dig through their documentation and coming back to the configurator. But like I say, it's nice that they have it. It is very handy. And once you go to finish here, basically you can click finish and it'll actually generate all these files for you. You can upload them to your Duet and then start printing and then start tuning. And like I say, you then start tuning through the files versus starting to come back to the configurator and tuning from there. So like I say, again, it'd be really nice if this web configurator was a little bit better. Now, I actually don't know if Duet make this. I don't know if Reprap, there's another team who actually do the configurator, and then Reprap or Duet just kind of leverage it. So, but yeah, I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. I haven't done a lot of Reprap firmware stuff, and like I say, it's not. I still prefer Clipper, but I bought an Ender 3 that came with this board. So I definitely wanted to try it out, and I did get my Ender 3 successfully printing with an auto level probe and that type of thing. So it was cool to see it, but yeah, unless I cannot find Raspberry Pis, I don't really see a reason to go to Reprap firmware for me personally. I do really like this Mellow Fly Reprap firmware version, just because for the price of $62, getting Wi-Fi and having 4 steppers, this is perfect for a Delta printer. Like I say, if Reprap's Delta configuration was a little bit more streamlined and a little bit simpler, this would be a go-to for me for Deltas. Just the fact that you can save $40 to $80 by not buying a Raspberry Pi. So that's handy there, but that'll kind of wrap it up for this video. If you guys have any questions on, Clipper, or, maybe you have some comments on Reprap firmware, maybe some things that I got wrong on my kind of first initial try, please let me know. And like I say, I'll probably make a quick video on the Ender 3 that I converted over, if anyone's kind of curious on it. And stay tuned for more printing projects ahead.